Hi everyone, wonderful people that you are. Buckle up, I suppose, would be the expression I would prefer. Get ready to be inspired and informed by my next brilliant guest. Definitely a man on a mission we're talking to this week to really shake up, reinvent, think about failing systems. But before we get started, before we hear from Dan Astin-Gregory, I just want to give you a quick reminder to check out my patreon.com site. I go on about this ad nauseum, but it's so important because when you sign up to my patreon.com site and give a little bit of financial support, it makes everything possible. It's approximately the price of a cup of coffee every month. But in return, you get early access to all my content. You get exclusive access to a question and answer session that's very popular. It's great fun. It's a great site. So join up, stir yourself into the mix, make it better by being there. Okay, let's get talking. Hi everyone, fellow time travellers. Great to be with you once again. It's time for another conversation with an inspirational, informative, enlightened individual as we struggle together to try to make sense of the, well, increasingly confusing world around us. Today's guest is definitely ticks all of the boxes. Dan Astin-Gregory. Dan is, well, I always see him described as an activist, a campaigner, which he certainly is. But hopefully, as part of the conversation we have, we can dig into a little bit more about, you know, what were Dan's motivations and interests before the world turned upside down for everyone. Anyway, good morning, Dan. How are you?
Good morning, Neil. Good to have you. It's interesting, and thanks for that lovely introduction. It's been a whirlwind of a weekend. I've just got back from New York. I've been at the United Nations, and I'm feeling a little, not jet lagged, but a little tired today. So it was to have a lovely introduction like that is a nice little welcome boost.
We're definitely going to get into all of that. You know, that whole the UN summit for the future or summit of the future. We're definitely going to get into that. But as I say, this is a recurrent theme for me in the early stages of these conversations that I've been having recently with a whole cast of characters. But you know, myself, a relative newcomer to the paranoia and the you know, freshly minted as a conspiracy theorist as I am, but I'm always I'm enduringly fascinated about the other people that I come into contact with, what their trajectory has been. So, I mean, just to kick everything off, and for people that are maybe not as familiar with you as I am, where did you come from, and what was it that sort of flicked you into this world of what is going on?
Well, yeah, I was going to pick up on that in your introduction, actually, because the term activist and campaigner is relatively new to me. In fact, in 2020, there was a point I actually recorded on a video on this. I said to my audience, I've always had a curious mind. I've always had a questioning mind, and I've always been skeptical of authority in a certain way. And I can tell you why I was skeptical of politics and government a little bit later on. There's a backstory to that kind of originates from when I was about 7 or 8 years old. But despite having certain views on the world prior to 2020, I'd never really taken a stand. I may have signed a couple of petitions, and I would have had strong views on certain things politically, but I'd never been a campaigner. I'd never been an activist. And it actually felt like a point in 2020 where I had to make a decision. Is this a path that I'm going to embrace? Because it feels like I'm someone who always goes all in. You know, if I do something, I want to do it to the best of my ability, and I want to give everything I've got. So it felt like a moment in 2020 when everything was unfolding. I had to make a decision, and actually to embrace that term activist, which I do thoroughly embrace now, and campaigner. But at the time, I thought this is going to be a life-changing decision because there's no real going back once you make that choice. So it's fascinating.
What were you doing? I mean, like that's when I woke up somewhere between, you know, the start of 2020 and the end of 2020. You know, I was, you know, I suddenly sort of shed a skin and became something else. But what were you before? What was taking up your time that you were giving your all to before?
I had a very different life, Neil. You know, I worked predominantly. I spent the first 8 years of my adult non-educational life in corporate. I worked in corporate from 2005 to 2012. I left in 2012 to pursue other matters. You know, I was approaching my 30th birthday, and I decided I definitely didn't want to remain in the corporate environment. You know, I couldn't face the prospect of another decade in that space. So I actually, in 2012, I went out on my own to start my own business, and the trajectory that I took in the 10 years after that, or 8 years prior to COVID, took many different forms, but ultimately my passion has always been about helping people to turn their ideas into reality. I really love working with people who have got ideas, products, services, solutions that can actually make a difference in the world. So I actually worked a lot in the health industry. It's a passion of mine. So I spent a lot of my time helping people if they've got an idea for a business or they want to make a difference in the world. I would help them formulate their kind of ideas and how they can get it into the marketplace, how they can actually take their transformational skills into reality.
So you mentioned the H word there, health. I can only imagine that from time to time that brought you into contact with the NHS, big pharma. You must have been walking some of the same corridors as those.
Oh, actually, well, I think this is probably why I was also predisposed to be rejecting of the pharmaceuticals. A lot of the people I worked with were very much in the alternative health space, natural health space, functional health space. I had my own kind of awakening on the health side in my 20s, and as a result, realized that mainstream health and pharmaceuticals they can be part of the solution. Emergency healthcare plays a role, but I learned that actually functional medicine, alternative medicine, nutritional health can play a far more substantive role in living healthily.
Can you tell us what it was in your 20s that re-educated you about health?
It wasn't one of these moments where I confronted my own mortality or anything. It was actually more a point of visceral disappointment with the state of my life at the time. I was in a corporate job that I was doing well at, and everyone's expectations. My parents were very happy the progress I was making, and societally accepted position. But I was deeply dissatisfied, and as a result, I turned that dissatisfaction into drinking at the weekend. I had a bit of a party lifestyle in my 20s, and I had a lot of fun during that time. But I woke up one morning just feeling absolutely terrible, and a friend of mine sent me this photo, and I just looked at an absolute state. And
the self-loathing stage, Dan.
Yeah, self-loathing. I think we have to go through it. So it wasn't like this major, oh my gosh, I've got this urgent medical decision. It was just I looked myself in the mirror and said I'm not happy with who I am. So the first thing I did was I said I have to take control of my health. I have to get the unhealthy, to get toxins out of my body. I have to start working on my mind, working on my health, and I entered then. The first step I took was to get into fitness. I went into the gym world, did lots of training, really became positively addicted, I would say, to training. And then I had some curves in the road. I would use lots of protein shakes and things like that. And it actually caused a problem in my liver. And I realized that a lot of these things can be toxic. So it took me then down a path of really looking at the natural side of fitness initially. And then I realized, looking at, I entered into the world of sport and met all these different athletes who were incredibly fit, but not necessarily healthy. And, I remember being at a conference one year and unfortunately, it's become very common now to hear of athletes dying early. But at the point where I was looking at this, athletes were kind of training their body to an elite level, but as a result, not taking care of their health. And it could actually create problems in their heart. It could actually create physiological impacts. So I wanted to understand how do you understand the balance between living a fit life and a healthy life. And then, I didn't have that faced with mortality, but sadly my wife did. Her mother was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer called mesothelioma, which is a rare cancer that's caused by asbestos. Another one of those safe and effective products that were kept on the market for far too long. And a single strand of asbestos can cause cancer that will end your life. At this moment, there's no way, there's no known way to beat it, but you can prolong your life. And Caroline's mission was a real inspiration to me because she took a totally, she rejected all of the chemotherapy. She was given 6 months to live. And they said that, chemo might say, give you an extra month. And she said, why would I go through all that pain to have an extra month of life? So she approached it through a natural process, through vitamins and food and various other protocols, and she ended up living for 6 years. It was a true inspiration. The longest anyone's ever survived with that cancer was 20 years. So she did she was very powerful. So that really set the groundwork for me when it comes to how we approach our health, which I think all of these things laid a foundation somewhat, Neil, for when kind of COVID came along and then the interventions for COVID, because I was predisposed to looking at things a certain way.
That it has been part of this. Everyone's talking about this being a time of apocalypse. This time of revealing and the time of people seeing things that were previously out of sight or whatever. It's amazing the correlation there is between people that like me, got slapped awake around 2020, and a burgeoning interest in what health means. And the very idea, for example, that, diet, people think about a diet as being a way to lose weight, and a diet shouldn't mean that. And this whole interest in the holism of being healthy. And you talk about that strange dichotomy between elite sports people who look great, but at the same time, the trajectory they're on to compete at the highest levels causes them all sorts of problems at the same time. And like my kids, my eldest boy, for example, he about 4 or 5 years ago now, he got very interested in going to the gym, and through that he got very interested in nutrition, and he did, he looks into things like the protein shakes and whatever that you're talking about, but he's very much about his diet and eating healthily and all of the rest of it. And it's amazing to me that I think part of the foundation for the victory that I genuinely believe that we will ultimately have, or if not us, maybe our children's generation, is founded upon this realization that health is the basis for everything. And it's a flippant thing to say, but I think more and more people are taking it very seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that was a decision I made, Neil, when I had that point of turning point in my life. I decided if I could actually take care of my health, that becomes a foundation for everything else. So it means that I show up as my best self in my work. I show up as my best self in my relationships. I have more energy to do the things that I want to experience and accomplish. And ultimately, it will create the conditions for a potentially longer life. So having that kind of breakthrough moment, and it was, I was fortunate because some people have very different breakthrough moments, but for whatever it takes to get to that point, the decisions we make after that are what's important. So, there's no looking back now. And it's my wish for everyone that they have that point where they recognize how important their health is and how, sacred we have to treat our bodies.
I definitely don't want to miss out on hearing, you mentioned right at the top something that happened to you politically when you were 7 or 8 years old, which can we rewind to that, and maybe I think that would be illustrative to the character that you are now.
Well, it's interesting. So before I jump back, during that period of transformation where I made that decision, I was going to turn my life into a different direction, which resulted in that path of health. It resulted in leaving my corporate career. I made fundamental decisions that would alter the trajectory of my life. And during that time, I made the decision not to listen to any news. I wanted to tune out. I sold my television. I didn't want any negative information in my head. I didn't want to be exposed to the constant cycle of trauma and, this anxiety-ridden culture that was emerging. And it's nothing like it is now because, now we've got it 24/7 on social media, whereas in its infancy at that time for me. But when I was growing up, my father was always into the news, so he would come home from work, the 6 o'clock news would be on straight away. And when he'd finished watching the 6 o'clock news, the local newspaper came out. And that was a time when the local newspaper was like a brick, it had more than 3 pages. So he would be really into the international news, the national news, and the local news. He was always consuming information. And I remember one day he came home and the television was on and it was a shot of Parliament. And as a child, I didn't really know what I was looking at. These grey-haired, suited men jeering each other across these green leather benches and literally going, "Whoa," and they still do it today. It hasn't changed. And I just thought, what is this? And so I asked my dad, I said, what's going on here? And he said, that's the government, son. That's Parliament. This is the House of Commons, and they're having a debate. And so as like a 7 and 8 year old, I was thinking, is that what's the debate? And it's just making animal noises at each other across the sky, which is what I kind of perceived it as a child. But he said, no, this is how the country is run. And I remember that moment, and I've never talked to my dad about it actually, but it set a course in motion. It made me really, really skeptical about government. And when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I remember one of my close friends, he was one of these gifted kids, one of the ones that are just hyper intelligent, just naturally intelligent. And he was fascinated by politics. at 11 years old, and he wanted to do a playground poll. So we were walking around the playground with this clipboard, like getting people's voters' intentions. And even then, I thought, what exactly is accomplished by voting for one of these parties? What will it do? Because I've just seen on the television over the last few years two different sides of the political equation just jeering at each other, and I can't really see what difference it's going to make. So it created a really early stage skepticism of the political system, which I hold today. But it only became really activated in 2020 when I realized the impact it can have on the quality of our lives directly.
And in 2020, I'm presuming, I think I kind of know what it is, but just talk us through that moment when all these things that had been in your background, early interest in early skepticism about the running of the country, and then a run-in with the corporate world, and then noticing that your health was not perhaps optimized. What happened in 2020? What finally the Damascene moment?
Well, this is a more selfish reason, but not that selfish. My wife and I got married in November 2019, and
All right.
we booked to go on honeymoon in Thailand in February 2020. And we're really excited about that. We'd take our time to create this dream holiday. And then, lo and behold, January comes along. We start getting news of this thing that's happening in China, and it's spreading really rapidly. So from a selfish point of view, I was thinking, this really better not mess with our honeymoon.
Our holiday. I love it. Yeah.
So
it's got to be personal.
I know it's personal. It has to affect you personally. This is what I've learned the last few years. So I started paying not an obscenely close attention, but an abnormal level of attention to what was happening compared to what I would normally do in the news cycle, particularly where what I've just explained, I'd spent most of that decade not paying attention to the news, but when it mattered, I'd started paying attention to it. And what I noticed was this increasing alarmism that was rising very rapidly. And I thought, well, this sounds serious. So I started to look into it. And what was interesting is very early on, I saw this like rising gap between, if I could illustrate like the actual reality of the situation, and then the presentation of the reality was kind of taking off almost like a plane on the runway. And that gap between the reality of the situation and the projection of it began to get wider and wider. And I remember very early on seeing the scenes from China, which, most people have. We almost need to have these flashbacks to remind ourselves of how crazy things got, even at the early stages. And I have a friend of mine who's an actor, and he does a lot of stunt acting. And we were talking about these scenes from China, and he said, Dan, I can tell you, when people die, they don't fall like that. They are not actual dead bodies. That's a scene that has been created for effect. That looks like a movie scene to me. And lo and behold, it didn't take long for despite this, rapidly spreading thing, that didn't happen anywhere else. So, that was quite clearly a fabricated moment in history to create a certain impression. So that created a very deep skepticism early on. And then I started to look into the data. I got really data driven on it. And again, I remember looking at this comprehensive data set from China that had been translated, and it showed that this mortality rate was low, and it was only affecting those who were 80 plus with 4 or 5 comorbidities. And I thought, 4 or 5 comorbidities, we're talking seriously unwell people. That's not just mildly, you're not just mildly disaffected by some sort of illness. You're seriously unwell. So I really caught the kind of skeptic wave as early as January. And then when we got back from Thailand, a week later, we're in lockdown. And that's when I saw the political implications of this firsthand. And that became a real turning point.
To me, I mean, I'm always wary about, after all this time, we don't want to get too bogged down in that. A lot of the people listening to this are, they've been on very similar trajectories, and it's always legitimate to hear it. But for me, the more significant point is that I have by now, and for a while now, that that injection, as it were, of skepticism that I took then has made me skeptical about everything. Mm-hmm. Because I think when you take on board, it's like, if you found out that your monogamous spouse of 40 years had been being unfaithful to you for 40 years, it would turn your life upside down, and you would ask yourself what had been the meaning and the reality of everything. And because I had been this naive, trusting individual, even trusting, I just wasn't really paying attention. I had too much else to be getting on with. I just wasn't watching what was going on. But when I realised that we were just being lied to about that, ever since it's been a process for me of wondering, well, did they lie about this? And did they lie about that? And that I now find myself in the situation where I freely admit that I just don't know what to believe. I look at everything now, whether it appears, I dip into mainstream media now and again just to see what they're spouting today. And then I also consume hugely of the so-called alternative media. And I find I just don't know what to believe.
Yes.
Yes. I don't know what to. It's like being on a rock face or something, a vertical climb, and I'm not sure what to pin into because I don't know if it'll hold. And so I'm kind of frozen, as it were, to torture that analogy, on the cliff face, not sure how to go down, not sure how to go up, because I don't know what to put my weight on.
Yeah, well, so let's take that example then of the monogamous partner. Let's say that was a situation that had occurred where, you put all your trust in an individual and then they broke your trust, which is, symbolic, really, I suppose, of our relationship with the government in that regard. But then not only do you grieve from that situation, but then you look at all of your friendships and all your other interpersonal relationships. There is a risk then you look at all of those and say, well, what if all of them have been unfaithful to me? What if all of them?
What if I was the only person that wasn't in on the joke?
Yeah. So, but I suppose I give that example to kind of almost reassure in a sense that the reality is that they won't all have been. And it's very easy in a time like this. And the subtitle of my podcast was Question Everything. And at the time, it made sense, but it was within the narrow container of the pandemic, which is ever now expanded in the same way that you've described. I look at a lot of other things and asking those questions. But there is a risk then you do start to metaphorically look at all of your friends as people that we can no longer trust. And it creates a worldview in our mind that the world is broken, it's corrupt, and it's this pervasive. It can become very pervasive. It can become all-encompassing. We have to remember the yin and yang of life and that there is the other side of that story. We have got those great friends that we can trust dearly. There are some great people out there in the world doing amazing things. There are people who live with honesty and integrity and trust that we can trust. But it doesn't mean that these other challenges are out there. And what I've come to accept, Neil, is that those things exist. And all that happens every time I hear another story that reinforces that belief that the political system is broken, all I need to do is go, okay, I've seen the root cause problem. I don't need 1,000 pieces of evidence to confirm that again. So for what it does for me is I get to a point where I understand what the problems are and what the root causes are. And then I have to ask the question, well, what can we do about it? Because if I spent all my time looking for further evidence to validate that problem, all I'm ever doing is validating that problem. And I do think the kind of culture we're in at the moment is in that space where it's just creating alarm and sensationalism often about the range of problems that we're facing. But if that's
I hear you, but I do wonder at the extent to which, I think once you find you've got, an infection, a deep-seated infection, or you've got a lot of decay in a tooth, you've got to make sure you dig out all of the decay.
True. Yeah.
Before you fill it, because otherwise you're just going to get something worse later on. Mm-hmm. And I'm aware the way the news cycles work now. I'm painfully aware of it. I mean, to the point where I can't watch it. You talk about you got rid of, you sold your television and so on, but it feels as though that we're on a surface that's as thin and inconsequential as the skin on a rice pudding or something. Or the surface tension that's holding quicksand, and that the news cycle keeps us moving, not physically, but sort of in thought, faster and faster all the time. Because if they allowed people to stop, they would sink in, and then they would realise that there was nothing solid underneath them. That the news cycle feels like it exists just to barrel us forward. Don't let them slow down, for God's sake. Don't let them stop and think, because they'll fall into this and then they'll realise there's nothing there. And so, on the one hand, I get there are good people. Of course, there are. The world is full of good people, and there are people doing all sorts of things unheralded in pursuit of a better way of life. And we'll get onto that. Yourself and this event you and I are both going to at the weekend, and so on and so on. But I do think as well that there has to be an extended period of lifting up the drains.
Yeah, well,
and finding out just exactly what's down there. Because if we just go, oh yeah, but it's all right, everything, people are mostly decent, and we can't be too paranoid. I think we might just be putting a concrete lid on something that's really, really toxic.
Yes, I'm not saying we put a lid on it. I suppose it's a case of when I find myself keep getting examples of the same problem, I say, I know what the problem is. So what's the root cause? And then how do we treat that? But the same token, you still need to, if you've got a particular illness that is driven by, perpetual bad health decisions, you still need to treat the symptoms in the moment. You can't just ignore them. But ultimately, at some point, you have to make a decision to actually treat the root cause of the problem. But it's very difficult because we live, I've assessed this over and over again. Is it the human condition reinforcing the systems that we're in, or is it the systems reinforcing the human condition? And how do we break that loop? Because if you zoom out far enough on these things, you see that these things have been happening for a very, 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 very long time. And again, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, you can look back hundreds and thousands of years and keep seeing the same patterns, which is, and I've been down that path, and it takes me back to the same place I've just come to now, which is like, well, I could look back to try and find an origin point that coincides with like the origin of the world, but that's always looking backwards, so how do I look forwards instead?
With a view to that, you also mentioned at the top that you just come back from New York and the UN, and that when you were now the Summit of the Future. I'm aware of that. I've spoken about that on the GB News and other places, and I've had guests on to speculate about just what on earth that might be about. But I think it's broadly unknown. And I'm very interested at the moment that there's so much that we're being encouraged to gawp at in the mainstream. Whatever the Sean Coombs allegations, the freebies that the Labour front bench have been accepting, all that stuff that's like squirrel. We all look that way.
Yes.
And yet, as you said to me, you sent me a photograph that you were one of three people outside the UN in New York, protesting, or at least drawing attention to what is going on there. And that in itself is hugely significant to me. Look at this. Isn't this salacious and, isn't this, great, water cooler gossip? But nobody's paying attention to the Summit of the Future. So talk me through a little bit of your recent activities.
Well, it has been confusing to me why there's been so little attention on the Summit of the Future, full stop. I have no doubt, having been there this weekend, that this is a significant event, a very significant event in the trajectory of things. When people look back at the origin of the 2030 Agenda 2030 in Rio, people can look back to that point and say that was the beginning of something that set this cause in motion. They can understand how iconic that moment was in creating the agendas that we're now grappling with today. What the Summit of the Future represents is putting that agenda on steroids. It is a re-amalgamation of that mission that the UN is on. It's a re-galvanizing of power. And I can tell you firsthand from the number of armored vehicles that lined every street that adjoined the plaza where the United Nations is stationed, that there was a lot of very important people in New York this weekend. A lot. I saw heads of state, I saw presidents, the World Economic Forum were there, the World Health Organization were there, Club of Rome were there, the Bilderbergs were there, the influential organizations of the world that are shaping and guiding our trajectory through the political means and others were all there for this incredible summit.
I'll just read you. I mean, I've got it up on my screen at the moment. I looked up the UN's own website about this Summit of the Future outcome document. World leaders adopt a pact for the future that includes a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations, which I find profoundly upsetting. The pact covers a broad range of themes, including peace and security, sustainable development, climate change, digital cooperation, that's another big red light, human rights, gender, red light, youth and future generations, and the transformation of global governance.
Yes.
Now, I mean, This is an unelected entity, and you've just name-checked all these other unelected entities, the WHO, the Club of Rome, God knows, the Trilateral Commission were probably there, the Bilderbergs and all of the rest of it. These secretive, private, unelected, unaccountable people that we neither ask for nor are the mechanisms in place for us to get rid of them. And yet they have the temerity to gather together to discuss the transformation of global governments. Hello, I think I might want to be involved in that conversation.
Yeah, well, it's also wrapped around a document that's been published called Our Common Future. Now, again, this is a document that's been produced by these unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats alongside their corporate partners to determine what our common future looks like. And they will argue that they've involved civil society organizations to shape this document. They'll tell you that it's the most comprehensive consultation they've ever done, and allegedly they've consulted 1 million people to do that. But 1 million people is a drop in the ocean compared to the 8 billion people that live on this planet. And I didn't just go there to protest, Neil. I actually had tickets. I had access to the what's known as the Action Days. So there was 2 days that preceded the Summit of the Future called the UN Summit of the Future Action Days, which was open to activist organizations, civil society organizations. And as founder of Free Humanity as a non-profit, I was able to get access to the Action Day. So I sat through 15, 16 different talks inside the UN, firsthand witnessing the nature of the discussion. Now, of course, I couldn't get into the main summit, but I was able to go into these Action Days, and it was just buzzword soup all day long. I mean, the amount of times it was almost like they were playing bingo. How many times can we say inclusive, diverse, secure, safe? But every one of those documents you've just referenced, the Pact of the Future, which is the main one, which it all hangs together off, which is wrapped around this idea of our common future, the future, the Digital Compact, and the Declaration for the Future of the Youth. I can't remember the specific nature of the name of the youth document, but I sat there for the whole day and soaked up all these conversations, and there was no space, Neil, to interject or challenge or debate. And it was very clear, and this is the problem. And let's take the word governance, global governance, and let's look at I'm a big fan of understanding the etymology of words. I want to know what they really mean. Governance means, and it's from the French word governor, which to govern, to rule, and command. So if you've got an organization that is coming together to talk about internationally how we can strengthen global governance, i.e. global command, global rule, then through multilateral agreements, which simply means collaboration with other nations. It's not collaboration. Collaboration is a different form. Once you make these a pact is a commitment. It's not simply a loose association anymore once you make a pact. So you've got this 2-day summit with all these world leaders making this pact, signing this agreement. And having sat through those talks, it's very clear that this is not the UN is not an impartial organization that is simply facilitating international cooperation, because I understand the need for international cooperation. We do live in a global world now. We share the oceans, we share the air, we share trade. And therefore, if you've got one country who's taking care of their backyard and the other isn't, it can have impact on all of us. So I understand the need to cooperate across nations to actually have some sort of global standard, but not to do so in a way that can subjugate our own self-sovereignty or a right to self-determination. Whereas what this is a very centralized accumulation of global standards that are being set by these powers that will alter the trajectory of our future. I mean, the Digital Compact, Neil, just very quickly on that, because I just wish I could have been recording the session, because there's going to be an outright war on dissenting information in the wake of this. The Digital Compact is really about the UN strengthening its ability to control the information architecture and to collaborate not only with governments but big tech. And it's very clear that in their mind, the science on every matter from climate to pandemics is settled, and they want to make sure that isn't challenged on the web. This is to me, this is a very serious event. These are a very serious set of documents, and to be one of 4 people there, I'm very proud that I was there. But
that's astonishing, Dan, that you were one of 4. When you think of the number of journalists that are out there running about, independent and mainstream, running about wondering what P Diddy was doing in his various mansions, and yet 180 degrees over there's a bunch of unknowns with all the power in the world getting together to discuss how they're going to. They've had the unmitigated gall to say they don't need to talk to the people anymore. They'll just move everything up to a level at which we're not involved. We just get to hear about it subsequently. And there were only 4 of you that bothered to turn up in amongst all the armoured cars to say, excuse me, what's this about?
Yeah. Yeah, and well, I mean, there's so much I could bring into the conversation. I mean, because I was walking the streets afterwards with my microphone, just trying to talk to the delegates, because I just wanted to ask some questions. What do you think this means for liberty? What do you think it means for human rights? Do you not think there's a risk of centralizing powers? I wanted to ask these questions. Most people wouldn't comment. So this is how diverse and inclusive it is. They wouldn't comment, but I did. The young people were more open. So I actually ended up talking to two very interesting leaders from NGOs from Africa, from developing nations, and to hear their perspective. And it's so saddening because they feel like they have to go to the UN because that's where the money pot is. It's the honey pot. So that they want to operate sovereignly. They want to operate on their own terms, but they have so many barriers that impede their ability to do what they want to do in their own nations that they feel like they have to go to the power center to get done what they want to get done. But when I asked them the questions, they held the same skepticism as myself, but they had to overlook that to go and get what they needed to.
Yeah, I do think there's a great hope. It's somewhere a formless, amorphous thing at the moment. But, the more people I talk to, the people that were the peoples that were skeptical about what started to unfold 2019, 2020, like all over Africa, especially all over North Africa, in the Middle East, all places that had experienced either totalitarianism in the form of the communist bloc or the Soviet bloc or whatever, or they had been made the unwitting, unwilling guinea pigs of God knows Western tinkering with humanity, and they were pre-warned, pre-programmed to be suspicious about anybody turning up with a medicine bag. Yes. They had seen it all before, and the peoples all over Africa that we're invited in the West kind of to pretend they don't even exist in a way. They talk about Africa as though it's a country. It's extraordinary. But there are people, like you say, that they're trying to be pragmatic and that they need funds and they need resources, but yes, they know it's underpinned by the thought that that's these guys.
Yeah,
there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Oh, totally. It really is not. And I asked the direct question: do you think, for all this talk of diversity and inclusivity, that this organisation truly represents your needs? And they both categorically said no. They know it's a charade. I mean, I don't say it lightly when it was buzzword soup. I mean, it really was. Every talk, every introduction was like, we need a safe, inclusive, secure, fair, equitable, digital world. And it's like, have you been instructed to start every talk with the same mantra? Because it's getting tiresome. So you're absolutely right. And this is why I'm so passionate about the idea of self-sufficiency and self-sovereignty, because it becomes a mindset shift. And it was really interesting talking to these NGOs from Africa, because I said, don't you think you have a greater opportunity to create a grassroots movement that can supersede what you could ever achieve with, yes, you'd have the funding, but, what if you had the will of the people behind you? But they said, it's very, and they're right, it's easy for us to say that in the developed world. It really is easy.
Just out of interest, Dan, when you talked about, all these, you name checked all these organisations and whatever, you said you saw presidents. Did you see any people there that were, let's say, household names, so to speak? Did you kind of star spot, as it were? Or was it all kind of just anonymous suits, making you wonder, these are the people making all the decisions about the future of the world, and I don't know who any of them are?
Well, many of them may be actually well known in their field. If we're in the tech world, the CEO of Google was there. I saw the CEO of Google. I saw his talk. It's the summit itself on the 2 days that I was not able to access. I'm sure there were kind of celebrities and well-known individuals in there championing their various things that they wished to champion. The 2 days I was involved with, there were heads of state and people of that nature. The CEO of Google was there on the action day that I was there. The World Economic Forum are represented, and by the way, they said the number one risk facing humanity is misinformation. I thought, you really do feel threatened. So there would have been, and I've never seen so much security, Neil. Never seen so much security. The Secret Service were on every street corner. The military were there. The police departments from all across America were there. every head of state had 10, 15, 20 people, with the earpieces in around them. It was a heavily secured event, which shows, again, the gravitas of the individuals in this building.
What did you get? Do they declare any kind of time scale? We watch, we have things like, Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2030 and so on and so on. And the rewrite of the WHO pandemic preparedness treaty and the IHRs that went along with it, feels like it's been kicked into the long grass while they, get on with the summit of the future with the United Nations. But did you get a sense of them saying, by this date, we will have global governance? By this date, we will have digital cooperation. You mark my words.
Well, not as such. And I think this is where perhaps there hasn't been as much attention on this event, because I think people pay attention when there is immediacy involved, when there is something that's sudden and apparently urgent. What this is about is accelerating Agenda 2030, the pre-existing agenda. It's about solidifying powers and kind of re-energizing the pursuit of achieving those goals. They opened by saying we've achieved something like 17% of the goals that they wanted to achieve. So this is about, over the next 6 years, aiming to get to 100% of those goals. And again, the biggest thing, because a lot of people still hold the UN in high regard. They don't really understand why people would criticize such an organization that supposedly came together to create peace on earth after World War II. But again, having been in the room, this isn't a neutral organization. This is not a non-partisan organization. This is not an organization that does not have its own agenda. It does have its own agenda. It is partisan, and it has its own set of ideologies. And rather than trying to educate and empower humanity to flourish, it takes the approach of constraint and control in order to achieve its goals. That's its modus operandi. So whether it's climate through carbon credits, which came up a lot, whether it's controlling the information sphere, it's about constraint and control. It's not about how do we transform humanity. There was about 3 sessions on education in total. I think, to me, the fundamental basis of a healthy and functioning society is a high quality education system, which I don't believe we have. So if this whole summit was about improving the quality of humanity, then to me, the subject matter that I sat through over the day that I was there is no way near connected to what it means.
Did you get a sense in terms of the attendance and the attendees that it was all encompassing, that it was truly global? Because you were invited, people aren't paying particular attention to it either, but you've got the BRICS nations, whatever that. Let's not get buried in how sincere we think the organisation of BRICS is. But there's the Enbridge project. There's the collapse, apparently telescoped, of the petrodollar. But there's the gold-backed token that people are in the other half of the world. 80% of the world's population are trading with something that isn't the dollar. And yet, that invites you to think, oh well, there's another camp, there's another polarity. But are they all simultaneously and maybe above that collaborating on this global governance fantasy?
Well, yes and no. So it was a truly global event. But what I've observed through being in the room and seeing the kind of delegation involved with this pursuit of diversity and inclusivity, they start to over-represent in order to, whether it's to kind of make up for past injustices or whether it's just for virtue signaling. As a result, the kind of dominant incumbent nations don't get as much presence or precedent on stage. So they're actually highlighting the developing nations more so than the developed nations, at least within the sessions I was sat within. But again, as I mentioned, that the developed nations feel that this is all very much paint on a canvas. It's not legitimate. But what I will say about the is it Javier Milei, the Argentinian president? He rejected the Pact for the Future. Russia rejected the Pact for the Future. So it does suggest that the BRICS is more of a breakaway group, and I think it's a representation of an early fracture in the kind of global cohesiveness.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. It's very interesting.
I'm interested. I'm interested also. I mean, I'm one of those that's kind of like, I've got this unshakable. I can't get away from the fact that I think it's all just about money,
Yeah.
ultimately. And the fact that the Bank for International Settlements, that sits in Basel in Switzerland, and that you've got the Fed and the Russian Bank and the Bank of China, all these that we're invited to think are adversaries, and they're all taking their financial cues from the one centralized point sitting in mythically, independent, Switzerland. And to me, it's all about money. So that when you say, you say like Argentina voted against, Russia voted against, it's very hard, isn't it, for people like us, and I've got limited access to intel, to work out how much of this matters in terms of like, I tell you what, we'll turn up and we'll vote against that. We'll be seen to vote against that, but it doesn't matter because we're all united by financial cooperation anyway. In my cynicism and my skepticism, I mean, I just look on at things and like, are we just being invited to watch? It's my turn to do this now, and if you do that bit.
Yeah, well, I think that you're right. I think the financial and economic systems transcend national governance. So you can have Russia, Argentina, and others reject it, but ultimately, the banking system, the financial system, and the economic systems are beyond that. So, and we've seen through previous world wars, you can have an arms manufacturer based in a country that's at war with another country, and they're shipping arms to the people you're fighting. It's
great, isn't it?
Comforting. If you ever need evidence that this isn't about national sovereignty, then you can see that in every war in history. So the same is true here. I think the financial mechanisms and the clues in the title was sustainable development goals. If it was just about sustainability, it'd be sustainable goals. It's sustainable development goals. It's about how do we financially benefit from these goals. And that's why, all the incentive systems, and it is carrot and stick now, it's carrot and stick. So there was one discussion at the end which featured John Kerry. He's well-known climate alarmist, essentially.
Yeah, he of the private jet that he forgot he owned. Yeah. John Kerry.
Well, the hypocrisy is huge. And I always try and avoid using terms like global elites. I don't like to dehumanize or pedestalize these individuals, but having been there and witnessed the hypocrisy, helicopters flying in and out, private jets coming in and out, armed vehicles everywhere, masses of security, dripping in wealth. It's the irony is not lost on me. The hypocrisy is not lost on me now. And it very is clear that this is an elite class. It really is an elite class who are trying to determine the future of humanity. But the problem is, what's the alternative? There is no competition for ideas. There's no competition for ideas inside the room. There really isn't. It's a club, and you're only really invited if you accept their ideas. And that's true of the action days as well. I mean, I had to fill out a form. People say, how did you get in the UN? Well, the answer's simple. I'm a founder of a non-profit and we're able to apply. But in applying to be part of the action day, you had to stipulate in what way do you contribute to these goals. So I wrote a story about how we're there to talk about decentralized international cooperation, which isn't actually a mistruth, because that's what I believe in. I think we can have a decentralized form of relations with other nations without losing our sovereignty. But that very filtering process at the outset showed me that this entire event is built for people who see the world the same way. And it would be hypocritical of me to say that we haven't got the same setup for ourselves. We're about to run an event where we've invited people who value liberty, human rights, bodily autonomy, etc., and we also have our own worldview. However, what was very clear inside the UN is this culture of conformity, and the whole machine is built for it. The whole summit was built for it. There's no room for dissent. There's no room for discussion, debate, open dialogue. And I was sat there many times just thinking, Neil, surely other people must be thinking this is just hot air.
I'm keen, with the time available to us, you and I, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, are both attending an event this weekend. The People's Reset, although I know there's a useful subtitle to that as well, because I'm always and increasingly determined that there is a way out of this, and that, like you, I subscribe to the notion that it's decentralized, subsidiarity. It's about people making their own decisions as close to home as possible, and so on and so on. Do you want to talk a little bit about your hopes for this event that you're actually sort of co-authoring, co-directing?
Yeah, so I first discovered the event nearly in 2020. I remember seeing it online and thinking, wow, these guys have got their act together, very early on. Derek Brose is the original founder of the event, was hosting an online seminar which brought speakers together from around the world to talk about not only what was going on, but actually what we can do about it. So I'd been tracking the progress of this event for some time, and then I met Derek at the Better Way conference. I think it was the same conference that you and I spoke at last, Neil, and we sat down and had a chat about our shared aims, and we had a lot in common, and we had a very similar view on how we can start to create change in the world. So he kindly invited me to go and speak at the event in Mexico this year. I was in January. They host these events every year in Texas and in Mexico, and they've been building real momentum. And when I walked into that room, I could sense there was a very different energy to some of the events I'd been to in the UK and Europe, which were very still much focused on the rearview mirror, what's gone before us. Whereas this was all forward facing. This is all looking out the windshield. Where are we going and how do we shape our own future? What's the destination that we're moving towards? And as such, there's a very different energy in the room. It's very optimistic. It's very hopeful. It's very inspiring. It's very positive. None of us are under any illusion that the difficulties we're facing aren't going to go away by themselves. But if we don't stop to say, where are we going? What do we do differently? Then we will end up in the same destination that we're taken by this other vehicle, which is the United Nations and their grand plan. So by the end of that event, I said, Derek, we need to bring this event to the UK. We agreed on day 3 of the event that we would do this, and we announced it from stage, having no idea how we were going to make it happen. But we made that commitment. So we're now gathering in Bath next weekend, from the 27th to the 29th, and we've called it Our Summit for Our Future. Now, before I talk a bit about why that's important, obviously the clear message is it's an antithesis to what's just happened in the UN. It's the people-centric version of what the UN has just done. But the very title, the People's Reset, was also born out of a rejection of the Great Reset. The conference was originally called the Greater Reset. It was born out of a rejection of the World Economic Forum's vision for society. So it's evolved since then to become the People's Reset because they want to move away from that, simple rejection of the World Economic Forum. But how pertinent we are now, a week after the UN summit, to start gathering our own people. Because if we don't gather in the same way that these institutions and individuals do, then, well, what's going to change? Now, we're probably not all going to show up in armed vehicles and helicopters.
Oh, I was planning to.
Well, Neil,
I'm coming in a tank.
You have to wear a little special pin badge as well. They all have these little Sustainable Development Goal pin badges. Maybe we need to make pin badges in tanks, and we can have a very similar meeting.
We had Derek here just a few weeks ago, actually, sitting in the same seat as you, effectively, and I was completely captivated by, he talked about not having used a bank account since he couldn't remember, community farm, and finding ways to source food in a different way, and contemplating different education. But it was when he said the bit about he really doesn't transact with bank cards and any of that. I thought that's amazing because I'm so preoccupied with it being all about the money. I just feel that what is, however uncomfortable, however onerous, the solution is relatively simple in that it involves not accepting that their way of doing everything is the only way to do everything.
Exactly.
If sufficient numbers of people just go, do you know what? You can keep your smartphone, and you can keep your router, and you can keep your central bank digital currency in your 15-minute city. I'm not going to live there, and I'm not going to live like that. And if enough people do that, then their mirage just disappears, like a mirage does when the light changes.
Well, definitely. I think this is a big part of it. And that was also a big part of the inspiration to bring the event to the UK, because that was what was so eye-opening. And it's very interesting being in Central America, going to Mexico, and there was a heavy presence from South America as well. And, they've lived through multiple digit inflation, so they've experienced financial inflation in ways that we can't even imagine. And as a result, they're so much further ahead on the economics, or the counter economics, as they call it, and the counter technologies. And there was this community, and two of the speakers actually that I learned about this are coming to the UK. They're flying in, Yoshi and Paula. They live in Ecuador, and they talked about how and again, there's no one size fits all solution, and this is what we have to avoid doing ourselves, because what Yoshi and Paula did, they've created a decentralized digital way of transacting that is in the blockchain, which means it's completely immutable, it's completely untraceable. And they initially started it as a way to transact with themselves within their small community. But then other people started hearing about it in other parts of South America. So now they have this currency that they can privately trade with, completely outside of the parameters of the state. Of course, that comes with risks, particularly in some of those countries where the governments aren't exactly tolerant.
So is there a how does that work? Let's say I want to join that gang, and I want to buy some food from a supermarket, or what? That's probably the wrong example, but how does a transaction of the sort that you're describing actually happen?
Well, let's just say a local market instead, because they're growing food on the land. So that's the beautiful thing. It's exactly the same. You have an app on your phone, you tap a button, and it's done. It's the same tools, but they are built in a decentralized way. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, decentralized digital currency is not the answer. Well, you may be right. However, there's also stories of people doing the same with localized physical currency. So they've created their own currency that is only tradable within these communities. So there's different ways to approach it. But either way, I was just so blown away by the fact that they've got these different technologies. And one of the speakers that we've got coming next Saturday is going to talk about a technology project that they're working on, which is, again, it's not only built for privacy communication, which is completely surveillance free, but again, it's another platform which is more suited to the Western world for digital transactions that are completely private. It's incredible. So a lot of the technologies that are oppressive can have the equal and opposite reaction. We can create completely privacy-based sovereign technologies, which gives the power back to the person rather than the commercial provider. So that's just one example, but it's this whole world starts to appear when you start to peer into the different world of solutions. And that's why we're so passionate about this event, because it's not just about resistance, because any one of us can go and stand. Any one of us could have gone to the UN and stand outside with a giant banner saying, stop the UN power grab. Any one of us can go to a protest. Any one of us can sign a petition. Any one of us, if we believe politics is the answer, any one of us can put a different cross in a different box. But when we start to actually live more freely ourselves, when we start to actually embrace the principles of self-sufficiency, and some of the things you just mentioned, aren't necessary for me. I like where I live. I like my home. I like my family life here. I'm not going to go and live in a type of community dwelling that others may want to do. I still want to be around other free-minded people, but I may choose a different path. So the beauty of this event, it kind of gives you like this a la carte buffet. I think they're actually an antithesis, a buffet, of a menu of options that you can pursue, whether it's ways to take control of your health. We've got Patrick Holford coming, and what he's talking about in terms of the nutritional approach to actually avoid Alzheimer's and dementia. The price of the ticket alone could actually save you, 10, 15 years on your life, but also help you avoid getting these, what some people believe are inevitable conditions. They're not. We're going to look at food independence. We're going to look at alternative systems. We're going to look at decentralized technologies. We're going to look at, so many different ways that every one of us can start to live more freely, independently of the technocratic state. And
I think the key, Dan, or some of it, one of the sort of, origin principles that I live by is that it's about fear as well as being about money. I believe that the people that are doing this, I think you absolutely certainly you saw it on turnout. You mentioned armoured vehicles. Case in point, we're governed by the most frightened people the world has ever seen. And what they're frightened of is other people. They're kind of like arachnophobic, except it's not spiders that they have an irrational fear of, it's everybody else on the planet. And the last thing, the fundamental thing we need to do is not fear them. I think too many people are frightened of what seems to be their capability to take control of our lives. And there's a huge release of tension, I think, to be obtained listening to you attending an event like you're describing, because it reminds you that you just turn away from them. Don't accept that the only way to do everything is as it's being laid down by them. That's the effect that they want to generate, that they have this global governance. But I think if they only do if you believe in it, and the minute you don't believe in it, another fairy dies.
Well, you're absolutely right. They've got a monopoly of ideas. That's how it is. So imagine a sport where there's only one team. Who's going to win the championship? The team that's the only team in the championship. That, unfortunately, is the situation we found ourselves in. We've got a very singular, centralized, modular set of ideas, and in order for that to change, we need to start to create our own. And that can be very practical solutions, like the sort of things we just touched on. But it could also be about a worldview. Your point, and we have to catch ourselves when we find ourselves also in fear, because that can become pervasive. If we don't have optimism for the future, then that energy of fear, and I remember there's a wonderful local garden that they'd started growing food during COVID. This was actually when I was still in Bristol before I moved south. And they told me that they were growing food because they were fearful that the government would restrict their ability to access food. And I said, from a psychological point of view, I said, how do you think that is when you're sowing the seeds of fear into the earth? I'm not talking about that. What's the metaphysical consequences? If you want to go there, you can go there. But I just said from the psychology, why don't you do it for the love of it and because it's the right thing to do to become independent? And it creates such a different energetic shift. It doesn't mean that you can't use the fear as a catalyst, as a raison d'etre to get started, but to continue, do it for the love of it, because then we change the energy that's involved. Because if you look at things like the Club of Rome, they are really, the kind of eugenics that comes with that, this kind of depopulation idea, it's all fear-based. It's all the idea that if we have too many people, then, the resources will be depleted, we'll pollute the planet. Well, we need a different story. We need a story of optimism, of resourcefulness, of hope. And if we don't create that story, then those dominant narratives are going to win, because, as Plato says, those who tell the stories rule society. And we've got the same people telling the same stories. So unless we have a different set of stories and a different set of ideas and a different set of practices, then there is nowhere else for anywhere to go. And Derek and I reflected on this after attending the summit. He said, you know what? If you actually strip away all the noise and you strip away the ideology and you just come back to like the fundamentals, they're still talking about the same functions of life: food systems, health systems, educational systems, digital systems. But they're looking through it from a very distinct worldview, a very distinct lens of command and control and constraint because of the fear that you mentioned. Well, wouldn't it be amazing? And again, as a parent now, this brings home so much of it for me, Neil, because as a parent, if dear Zach is, being a little tearaway, running around, one part of me is like, yeah, you made that child. You've got a freedom-seeking, independent little child. But sometimes he has to know it's time to get out the door. Nursery starts in 5 minutes. You've got to get there on time. So, but I have the opportunity to be authoritarian and impose my will on my son, or I have to still set a boundary because it is important, but then educate him and say, hey, look, you've got a fun day ahead. If we get ready and get there on time, you're going to have even more time to have fun. So there's always two or more ways that you can approach it, but it's the philosophy of constraint versus the philosophy of empowerment. So I think at the ultimate core of what the People's Reset stands for is of empowering people to make decisions for themselves. But as I said, there isn't as many of us that we think that are willing to take that responsibility that comes with that, because it's, like I said, it's easy to go to a protest, it's easy to sign a petition, it's easy to vote on a ballot. It's not so easy to take the responsibility that comes with living free.
That's true. I don't deny it. I'm as guilty of apathy and reluctance as the next non-combatant. However, I think there's something in the fact that until Roger Bannister broke the 4 minute mile, nobody could run the 4 minute mile.
Yes.
By now, every other joker that runs around the park can break the 4 minute mile, or so it would appear. Likewise, Hillary and Tenzing, Everest. Now there's queues to get to the top of Everest. It's very potent if someone achieves something that has hitherto appeared impossible, then
Absolutely.
it's that morphic resonance thing. I remember reading about how there's a great book by Rupert Sheldrake about it's about morphic resonance, but when they first introduced barbed wire in the grasslands of the United States of America, all the horses that were that were within, they were cutting themselves to ribbons because they were running into the barbed wire. And people said, we're just going to have to take barbed wire away because these horses are always going to get hurt like this. Not only did those horses that had the colts and whatever born to the horses that had cut themselves up in the barbed wire, the colts learned not to do that. Believe it or believe it not, horses thousands of miles away that had never encountered barbed wire were giving birth to foals and colts that also didn't run into barbed wire. The whole species learn, as a sort of a collective unconsciousness would be the sort of theory around that. But my point, however much veritas you want to invest in that, the point remains the same, that once people see something can be done, then everybody can do it. So if you got 200, 500, whatever people it is that are coming to this event at the weekend, if just a few of them start to live like that and it's apparent and visible, then that takes off on a species-wide level, potentially.
Absolutely. And that's, I mean, working with Derek on this has been inspirational because, I've heard of the stories of the people who were at the first summits, and then 2 or 3 years later, they're the ones on stage talking about what they've done because they've actually not just listened. They haven't just passively observed. They've gone and applied, which is why we're passionate about calling this event an activation, because it's designed to activate something inside of you that makes you go and do things differently. Because when we all start to do things differently, then that's how things start to change. We create a ripple effect. And if morphic resonance can help us along the way, then so be it. But we've got to be the catalyst for it.
It's just, I think it's about embracing difficulty.
For sure.
Because it will be difficult and there's no point in sugarcoating it. We've all been seduced into a convenience lifestyle, but by which we have made ourselves, if it's free, you're the product, and so on and so on. And it's generations of it. And it will be difficult and painful. But that is what has to be what is warmly embraced. Is the hard way. It's got to be the hard way, because we've seen where the easy way gets us, and it gets us to this empty materialist void where there's jokers turning up in armoured cars at the United Nations to tell us what the future's going to look like. That's where you get. And if the other way is the harder way, well, so be it.
Yes. Well, it is. That's how we create the kind of nanny state environment we're in, because people aren't taking responsibility. That's really it. So it's almost like this, but it's like a paternal relationship. I've talked about that through the government. They will step in and take this kind of authoritarian role if the children are misbehaving or perceived to be misbehaving, and that's kind of what we're witnessing. So it's if we want things to change, we have to take the responsibility. We don't have to make it deliberately hard. We can seek simplicity in what we do ourselves, but the learning curve itself. But we have to fall in love with learning again. I think people who come this weekend, they are going to fall in love with learning. They're going to be fascinated, like I was in Mexico, that drew me to say, we need to take this event to London or the UK, Bath, where we are now this time. Don't give the wrong information out. It's in Bath. Don't go to London.
Are there still tickets available? Can people,
Yes, you can still join us. We should have capacity right up to the last minute. So if you decide on the morning you want to come along, we should be able to get you in. But we will be live streaming it as well, so people can watch at home. But there's nothing like being there in the room. We've got 25 speakers. Neil, you're there on Saturday. I think are you there for a couple of days now, I think?
I'm there for the whole of Saturday. And if people are picking up on this interview after the fact, will there be a recording of the live stream that people can, subsequently have a look at and dip in and out of or watch the entirety?
Absolutely. So the whole thing will be live streamed. That replay will be available immediately, but then we're going to chop it all up into individual talks. In fact, if you want to get a sample of what the previous year's events were like, you can go to the People's Reset or the Greater Reset Odyssey channel, which Derek has curated. And it's got all of the previous talks from the last 4 or 5 years. So you can really get a sense of the type of material, the type of conversations we're having. And all of that will be made available after this event as well. But if you can, come and join us in person, because, there's nothing more powerful than really getting belly to belly one another and sharing these ideas.
It's interesting to me, we've learned over the last few years, people say, we used to wonder, how the horrors of the second half of the 20th century happened, how were populations, herded into behaving in the way that we saw in Germany and in the Soviet Union and all of the rest of it. But now the last few years you go, I see how that was done.
Yes.
And but on the complete flip of that into something positive is that by paying attention to this to what you're saying and listening to the attendees and the delegates and whatever talking, what they have to say at Bath about this alternative. It's getting in at the beginning of something, because people also fantasize about being there at the start. And there's a paradigm shift coming.
Yes.
That is undoubtedly the case. People are going to start understanding, thinking, interacting, transacting, educating in a different way. And how exciting to have the opportunity to be one of the ground floor builders of it. Do it now. Do it now. Be an early adopter of the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's, again, this is, when we came back to the UN piece, you've got the Argentina, Russia rejecting. It's this peeling away from the establishment, which we're seeing, since COVID, the movement has grown. The political fragmentation. People can now see where the establishment lies. In America, people know it's the blue team that are the establishment. Unfortunately, you've only got one or two. You've only really got one other choice to move away from it. That might suit some, but ultimately, we can see where the establishment is. But what we're seeing is a breakdown of that establishment. But if that establishment is not followed by something that's more healthy, more free, more conscious, then we will just end up in another version of the same thing. And that's why the kind of grassroots alternatives have to be built now, because during COVID, and I didn't talk about this, Neil, earlier on, but, we were talking about my path into activism. And I love learning and I love to understand how things work. I always have. That's always been one of the things that my mind has always been tuned to since I was very little. So during early 2020, before I really embraced activism, I wanted to know, what would be my approach. So I started reading loads of books like The Blueprint for Revolution by Serdar Popovic, which outlines how this group, Opta, actually ended up toppling Slobodan Milosevic. It was incredible in Serbia, how they actually toppled the dictator. It actually breaks it down. But it also showcases what happens if you don't have a replacement, because what happened was just like tyranny light afterwards. All that work, all that effort, they just had a lighter form of tyranny. And they realized, and all the work they do now is to help educate change makers or activists, however you want to describe them, is don't just resist. You have to build. And so, in the paradox of the last week, I've just been in New York on the resistance side, holding the boundary. That's what it is. We have to protect our boundaries. This weekend is about building. We can do both. It's the yin and yang. We can resist, but we have to rebuild, and we have to think forward.
You mentioned there that we have to be healthy, free, and conscious, Dan. I think those are three very important words to take away. I think who wouldn't in the brave new world want to be brave, new, and conscious. I think that's right. So Dan Astin-Gregory, that's been lovely talking to you. It always is. I look forward to seeing you when I see you. And but for your contribution to this effort today, 1,000 thank yous.
Thank you.